Alleluia. Om Mani Padme Om. Allah Satnam.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Reverend Gordon Preece. He's an Anglican minister and a director of the Ethos Centre for Christianity and Society. And we were speaking with Gordon last week. We covered quite a lot of interesting topics last week, Gordon, but there's one which is fairly topical at the moment, and that's same-sex. You've written quite a bit on that. What's your basic view on same-sex marriage? That's a very simple question, which will have a long answer. Go for it.
Right, yeah. No, it's certainly not my favourite topic. I keep getting asked to write and kind of put my head on the chopping block over it. But it is a very significant issue. I guess I think what the Bible says is that there's a sexual ecology between male and female, and that's the basic difference that makes the difference in marriage and that marriage makes to society. So I think that's the foundational social institution of difference and how we relate to those who are different or other from us. And then the ripples go out from that into families, into extended families, into tribes, into other institutions and nations, etc.
Right.
So I think that ignoring that basic difference, I think, is problematic for whether it's in the church or in society in general. But we live not in a specifically Christian society, although a majority of people still say that they're Christian.
Yes, nominally.
At least nominally in our society. And we live in a democracy, and there are a range of different views, and it is quite likely that same-sex marriage will be legalised, and if that happens, then I think we need to discuss what's the best way to deal with those issues, because what I'm concerned about is, while I think we need to safeguard the rights of people of different sexuality, that we, and by and large, I think society has changed those discriminatory laws. They've been largely changed, but there seems to still be something very significant symbolically about marriage.
Yes.
The problem with that is that marriage has been around for millennia, and despite the fact that it's changed in some ways over time, it has never actually changed from being basically between a male and a female. And it seems to me that that's an extraordinary kind of social experiment that, after pressure for 20 or 30 years, particularly say since the 70s, that we're talking about basically changing the definition of marriage. Now, it seems to me that it's a statist kind of thing. It gives too much power to the state to actually define another institution which has actually been around longer than the state, which is more fundamental than the state. And for the state, or 5 judges against 4 in the American Supreme Court, to undermine the process that was going on in lots of different individual states, in the democratic process and discussion that was going on there, and to say, well, it's 5 against 4, now we completely change the definition of what marriage is, and we in effect make this a constitutional kind of matter. It seems to me that that's a massive overreach by government, and that's certainly what the 4 minority justices on the Supreme Court in the States said. I don't think a lot of these things have been thought through very well at all. I also think it's adultist in the sense we talk about sexist or racist. Well, I think it's adultist in that it often forgets about the role of children and the role of children to know their biological parents.
Yes.
Now, I know in various same-sex marriages, there are people who are often children who are raised in those, and they say they're loving same-sex marriages, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not wanting to have a go at them at all in that sense. But it's clear that in terms of the ideal, the great majority of Australians, and it still shows up in surveys, that 70% or so would say that the ideal situation is for children to be raised by a mother and father.
Yes.
That has been sociologically normative for decades. And it seems to me people who are very strongly supportive of same-sex marriage, it's like they have these two contradictory things going on. That
Yes.
often people are saying, well, it's best for children to have a male and female parent, to know their biological parents. But on the other hand, that they've got same-sex marriage. And so I think that's something that needs to be worked through, and to work through the implications for children. Now, to some extent, with adoption by same-sex couples and things like that, that the chicken has kind of flown the coop in some ways, we might say, or fostering by same-sex couples. And I remember Kevin Rudd said, well, it would actually be better for those children to be with a married couple than to just be in a temporary situation. And I think there's truth in that. But I think we also need to check out the sociological evidence about to what extent do same-sex marriages last. Yes. And I think there's a fair bit of sociological evidence from those places that have had same-sex marriage for a while that they don't actually last that long.
Oh, really?
And so that's another aspect. I think a third aspect is that to what extent, and here I basically often read, gay and homosexual sources to see what they're saying themselves. To what extent is this changing marriage from being an exclusive relationship, an exclusive covenant, to actually being like an open marriage? And there's evidence that about 50% of those same-sex marriages are actually operating in terms of an open kind of marriage. And that's coming from gay sources that I've read.
Yeah, well, that starts to put a complexion on it, doesn't it? And we'll examine that complexion after the break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. And we're speaking with Reverend Gordon Preece, an Anglican minister and director of the Ethos Centre for Christianity and Society. And we're talking about same-sex marriages. One of the issues is, one of the ways we might be able to manage this. This is very inflammatory at the moment. What would be some steps to settle it down a bit?
Well, I think one way would be to try and separate church or religious marriages and state marriages.
Right.
And it may not solve all the problems, but I think it would take some of the heat out of the situation. And that would mean that would help safeguard the religious liberties of religious celebrants who do not feel that according to their sacred texts or according to their conscience that they can take same-sex marriages. And like we're already seeing at the moment pressure on, say, the Catholic Archbishop of Hobart, that because he wrote something out to his schools, to Catholic schools, about don't mess with marriage, that he's been taken to the Anti-Discrimination Board in Hobart. And of course there's been lots of examples in the United States and some other parts as well. So one possibility of seeking to prevent that problem and to allow for religious liberty would be to actually separate state weddings. So it's more like the European situation. You go to the town hall, the registry office, and you take off the part at the end of the service where you sign the your name, etc., in the wedding register, and that is actually done at the town hall.
Yes.
And so people can then go and have whatever kind of religious or non-religious celebration that they want to have.
Yes.
After that. So I think that's one of the ways forward. The Anglican Archbishop and the Primate, the leader of the Anglican Church of Australia, he's the Archbishop of Melbourne, Philip Freer, has basically argued that in an article that he wrote in the Age. I was saying that sort of thing about 3 years ago actually. I came across the article that I wrote in Religion and Ethics online for the ABC, suggesting that is likely, given that same-sex marriage is likely to happen, particularly if Malcolm Turnbull makes a comeback. And so, it didn't take too much of being a prophet or something to say that, but it was interesting. Yes. 3 years ago, and that's likely to happen. But we'll see what the plebiscite says when we actually have that. It's good that I think that people are having their say, but we hope people will have their say civilly. I think that's a critical issue. Exactly. How can we do that respectfully? How do we recognise there are differences of opinion about this? It is a very significant kind of issue, and so that Christians and other religions are careful in terms of the language that they use in relationship to homosexual people, and are respectful in terms of that kind of language that they use, and vice versa. That if you express some concerns about same-sex marriage, that you're not labelled a bigot.
That's right.
That there are rational reasons grounded in natural law. There are traditional kinds of reasons as well that make people take this really seriously.
Absolutely.
And that issues of marriage and family are incredibly sort of intimate issues. They're closely related to our identity. Now, this is where I think some of the problems come, because we've developed a range of sexual identities. So we can talk about being gay, for instance, and that becomes our identity. Well, Foucault is a great French postmodern thinker who did identify as gay. Foucault said that in the modern world, sexuality has replaced the soul. That sexuality has become our source of identity. Well, without saying that, older people aren't sexual, nonetheless, in lots of parts of our lives, we're not that sexual.
No.
And sexuality isn't the real source of our identity.
No.
Do we say we're somehow less human? For those many, many people in the church, particularly many women, who are single or have led chaste lives, are we saying they're somehow less human because they haven't been sexually fulfilled?
Yes. Yes.
There's a flip side of this.
There is.
In terms of the way the issue's been debated. And I think that is often kind of debased some of those incredibly faithful people in churches and in other religions who have been single and been very faithful.
Yes, and I think there's also the extrapolation into the broader kingdom of animals, if you like, all the way down to amoeba. There is a sort of a relationship between male and female which has to happen. But that's a lot of navel gazing, and we're very lucky in the West, and particularly in Victoria and particularly in Melbourne. We can gaze at our navels all day long because we don't have shells flying over our head and bombs, etc. Syria. You've written on Syria. It's an important issue, massive issue. What have you got to say about that?
Right. How long have I got? I don't pretend to be an expert on Syria, but I've done a fair bit of reading. I've listened to some experts talk about some of the issues there. I think we need to look on the Syrian issue, as one of those experts that I heard recently speak about it, as an extension of the Cold War. This is a new Cold War that's going on. We've seen the problems between Russia and the Ukraine, and Australia getting involved innocently in terms of something like 30 Australians were,
Yes,
were,
on that
were,
flight, yeah.
were gunned down on that flight. And what we're seeing now in Syria, where Russia has a port, they're now flying as well and bombing. And it appears they're not bombing IS, but they're actually bombing other rebel groups, opposition groups.
That's right.
To Mr.
Which in
Assad.
time is going to affect the situation, and we're out of time. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Reverend Gordon Preece. He's an Anglican minister. He's also director of Ethos Centre of Christianity and Society. And we're talking about Syria. Bombing, there's quite a lot of bombing and stuff going on over there, and all of the different players. What's the outcome of the different players?
Okay, I've got three parts to this. So I think my answer would be about, bombs, borders,
Yep.
BORDERS, and borders as in BOARDERS, and refugees, etc. And how do we respond? First of all, in terms of bombing, I think breaking international law and going into Syria to bomb only set a precedent for the Russians to do the same thing.
Exactly.
And now on the side of the Assad, the Assad regime, and bombing the kind of rebels, the opposition forces, as much as you have a united opposition in Syria, that's part of the problem. There isn't really a really sufficiently cohesive opposition to replace Assad, and so you have a similar kind of problem with getting rid of Saddam or Gaddafi. That these, they were dictators. I'll excuse the French, but they were bastards. But as one great American president once said, but they were our bastards. Now, I don't want to overly identify with that, but what I would want to say is that they did actually have a certain minimum kind of adherence to try and maintain some religious liberty.
Yes.
And that safeguarded Christians and some other minority Islamic groups and other groups in the Middle East. And what's happened is, in a naive faith in democracy, we think, well, some group gets 51%, but there is nothing of the millennia-long build-up in Judeo-Christian countries, etc., through the Renaissance, through the Reformation, through the Enlightenment, even in some ways going back to the Greeks, of a human rights tradition that protects the rights of minorities. And you just don't have that.
No.
So we've got almost complete forced evacuation of Christians from the Middle East. Now,
Yes.
people who've been there for 2,000 years. So bombing has been a disaster, really, because we're seeing innocents being killed both by the West and the East. And no wonder Muslims are crying out and saying this is a crusade.
Yes.
They see it, from both sides. They see Western Christianity, what they see as Western Christianity and Eastern Christian powers bombing, and it doesn't meet the requirements of just war, where you safeguard the lives of the innocent and non-combatants. We have too much trust in our technology. But in the end, the technology is guided by the people who are actually feeding that information in.
That's right.
And there are the greatest recruiter for terrorists in the Middle East and in Afghanistan is the bombing raids. And that goes, photos are taken, they go on social media, they are literally used as the recruiting posters for Islamic State, for Al-Qaeda, etc., etc. So I think that's been a disaster. Just because IS doesn't respect borders doesn't mean that we shouldn't respect international borders. We end up starting to become not as bad. We're moving in their direction by not recognising the significance of borders.
Compromising,
Secondly, in terms of those borders, as I said. I think it's utopian to think we can do without borders. And it actually says in Acts 17 about God designed the borders, places for people to inhabit, because good fences make good neighbours. And so we need those sorts of things so people can make a home, and they're like the bicycle wheels, the little wheels on the side.
That's right.
That help us learn how to love people on a smaller scale in our homeland, so that then we can actually be hospitable. You need a home to be hospitable, so that we can actually then be hospitable to strangers and others.
Right.
And so we need to respect that, because what we're seeing now in Europe, I think, while I'm very sympathetic with the German Chancellor, who's the daughter of an East German Lutheran pastor, the problem is a lot of people are really reacting against that now, and a lot of people, particularly in Eastern Europe, have had experience of Muslim oppression.
Yes.
So they're very fearful of that. So I think we need to maintain respect for borders. Thirdly, I think with people, the enormous number of refugees, I think it may be something like 11 million, I think, who've actually had to move from Syria in one form or another. They've been displaced. That is something that's incredibly challenging, and we need to work out ways in which we have them as borders. Some will be permanent. It's 12,000, I think, in Australia. Some will be temporary. Not everyone's going to be able to be accommodated permanently, and we need to try to do that as close as we can to the places that they've come from.
Yes.
But those camps and that, like the Turks have 2 million, Jordan has about 1 million, Lebanon has at least 1 million.
It's huge.
And it's enormous. But there's not enough support coming from the West. Australia's cut our aid, and in Africa and places like that. There are lots coming from Ethiopia, which is a really, from the other side of Ethiopia, which has basically suffered enormously under dictatorship. And so the camps don't have enough food, supplies, etc., etc. So that's one also of the main reasons why people are fleeing to Europe. So it needs to be an international kind of almost of a Marshall Plan kind of level.
That's right.
After World War II to try and address this issue.
Yes, and it's a massive issue, and we're running out of time, so we won't be able to go fully into it. Gordon, thank you so much for coming in again.
Pleasure, thank you.
And with your involvement with Ethos, we might well speak again at some time.
Great.
So thanks again.
Love to. Thank you.
You've been watching Harmony and Diversity. We'll be back next week. Thanks for watching.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om.